to Tyrannus Hall Podcast, a grace-filled space where we discuss the missional mandate of the Canadian Reformed Churches. My name is Winston. I'm the pastor of Jubilee Church in Ottawa, and I'm here with my co-host, Bill Young, who's the pastor of Blessings Christian Church in Hamilton, Ontario. How you doing, Bill?
I'm doing fantastic. Great to join you for this initiative.
Yeah, so this is our very first session of Tyrannus Hall. We hope it's the first of many. What's with this name that we've chosen, Tyrannus Hall? Where does that come from? Maybe you could just explain that for our viewers.
Sure. Well, Tyrannus Hall is something you read about in the Bible in Acts 19, where Paul is in Ephesus and he takes a number of his disciples into this lecture hall that was used in Ephesus, and it becomes the venue for Paul to have theological discussions with others and to teach others. And I think that makes such a suitable name for what we want to do. We want this to be a space where we converse with one another regarding the challenges that we face within the Canadian Reformed churches in terms of being an effective witness to Christ in this world.
Which is, of course, what Paul was doing in that moment of Acts. He's using that hall for evangelism, for mission. So that's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about being missional churches, being on mission with the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ as Canadian Reformed churches. And we want to do that through this means. We'll see how this goes. We want it to be gracious and positive. And I think that there's lots of really interesting and beautiful things going on in Canadian Reformed churches. So we're going to highlight some of what's going on across our nation, what people like yourselves are doing there and Blessings as well as others. And then we also want to talk to other people that are perhaps more experts in their fields who have interesting things to talk about when it comes to missions.
Absolutely. And I believe we're going to start with Arjan DeVisser. And he, of course, has a very interesting background, having been a foreign missionary in South Africa. And more recently, he's been, of course, teaching at the Candian Reformed Seminary in the area of, among other things, Missiology. And so we want to engage him in terms of his research and his knowledge and his experience regarding what he might say to us about this important calling that we have in the world today. And we're expecting to harvest a lot of insights from Arjan DeVisser.
Yeah, so this interview we've got with Arjan, we've pre-recorded it. We've got a number of sessions pre-recorded for this summer. So now let's go to our interview with Arjan. Well, welcome to the podcast, gentlemen. We've got Bill Young with us as usual, and today we're chatting with Dr. Arjan DeVisser, who is the professor of ministry and mission at the Candian Reformed Theological College. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the podcast.
Good to be back.
Good afternoon.
Arjan, I wonder if I could begin with a question for you. We've been discussing on this podcast how things in Canadian Reformed church culture are changing, and one of the ways in which they're changing is that churches are becoming more missional. Evangelism is more on the horizon of churches. You see more church plants occurring. You see churches hiring mission workers. We're so glad you can join us because this is really in your area of expertise. You've taught missiology for many years at the Candian Reformed Seminary, and in some ways, this might be the fruit of your labors. But perhaps just share with us how the Candian Reformed Seminary prepares men for missional contexts, and maybe even talk about how things have changed over the years. So I know that there are now, missional placements or internships that didn't exist before. Perhaps just share a little bit about what the seminary does to prepare men specifically for missional endeavors, church planting, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. That's a nice question. Yeah, so internships is one aspect, and the other aspect is what you teach in class. So we have, let me start with that, with the courses that we teach. So basically we have a course for foreign mission and a course for domestic mission, or world mission and home mission, whatever you call it. And mixed in those two is also a bit of world religion studies. So with the domestic mission course, we also talk about Islam in Hinduism and Sikhism, because those are religions that you meet right here in Canada. And in the foreign mission course, we might talk about mission in Africa, and animistic cultures, and other places, other religions in the world. So yeah, that's in those courses which I'm teaching myself. I try to give the biblical foundations and history and some of the issues that you meet when you become a foreign missionary. So for example, the relationship between the churches in the West and young churches on the mission field. And in the other course, evangelistics, as we call it, we talk more about what is the evangelistic nature of the church and the duty of believers and church planting and so forth. And then we have some extra stuff that happens. There might be the occasional guest lecturer. And we have a rotation for the January interim as well. The January interim is 2 weeks in January every year. And every fourth year, the theme of that is mission related. So then we try to bring in some guest lecturers as well. So that's what happens at the seminary. But beyond that, personally, I believe, especially something like this, is something that is perhaps more caught than taught. So I think it's really important for the students that they get to see how mission is done. And for that reason, I think it's about 10 years ago that I proposed to the Senate and to the board that we would add one more internship to the internships that we had, and that's called the mission internship. It's a minimum of 2 weeks, but I always tell the students, try to do more if you can. But yeah, that has also to do with family circumstances and whether they need to make some money during the summer and stuff like that. Yeah, there's a goal and opportunity for students to go to a place where they might not otherwise go. So some students go to PNG for an internship of 3-4 weeks. Some have been to South Africa, Timor, Brazil. Others prefer to stay in North America. Some have to stay here because of family circumstances, children in school and so forth. To mention a name, I think for the last 6-7 years, pretty much every summer I've sent someone to Richard Bultje in Niagara Falls. And what I like about that internship is Richard is very, what shall I say, boots on the ground. He talks to people on the street or at Tim Hortons, and it's just very good for a student to go along with him and see how he does that. It's also a bit scary, but it's good for the student to get that experience. By the way, what's the most scary assignment for the students during the 4 years that they are at seminary? As part of the evangelistics course, they have to do an assignment, do an interview with an unbeliever. And yeah, it's interesting. Some have a hard time to find an unbeliever. But I have to give credit to the students that, for example, if you guys have just gone to a Tim Hortons or to a bar in the neighborhood and walked in there and tried to find someone, and then they have an interview with that person.
Yeah, Arjan, I think that's a great assignment. Continue to give intimidating assignments to the students. I think, in fact, a great way to prepare for missional context is to do exactly that. Mm-hmm. Interview unbelieving people and begin to enter their thought world. That's a very, very fascinating project. In some ways, the line between domestic missions and foreign missions is being blurred because of the phenomenon of immigration and refugees. And we're encountering here in Hamilton, for instance, people from the Far East, the Near East, from Africa. And so some of the things that were really important for foreign missions are now becoming important for domestic missions. And yet, on the other hand, it's still very, very different. So our colleague Ian Wildeboer was in Papua New Guinea, where you could speak in the market and draw a crowd of 200, 300 people. That's just not possible here in North America. It's a secular country, and yet few people identify as atheists. More people would categorize themselves as spiritual, but not religious. What do you think is important for us here in North America to have a missional presence, to be evangelistic, that wouldn't be true on the foreign mission field? What are some ways for us to have a hearing with unchurched people, to promote the gospel that just wouldn't be the go-to tactic if you were elsewhere in the world?
Mm. Yeah. When you go as a North American person to somewhere else in the world, you are there as an outsider. You have a different color. You are different already. You have to learn the language. So that makes you to stand out. I've been a missionary in South Africa, and I thought it would be really difficult to be a missionary in Africa because I was going to be the white person who was totally different than everybody. And yet at the same time, being so different also made it easier, because the people are asking, oh, who is this white guy? Is he a policeman or a spy? No? Oh, he's a missionary. Okay. So then they know you're a missionary, so you're supposed to speak about God and about faith. They expect that from you. But when I came to North America, I'm a white guy here. I look like other people, more or less. They cannot see that I'm a missionary or a pastor. And now I have to play the role here that the black Christians in Africa have to play among their own people, which is that would be the comparison, I think. So now, in that sense, it's not much different. The white people here have to do the same thing that the black Christians in Africa have to do, or wherever they are in the world. You have to be a Christian of integrity and live your life and be that person that stands out because you're different, and in a nice way different, and in such a way that it is attractive, and then hoping and praying for opportunities to get to talk about the gospel.
Sure. There are a lot of urban missiologists in North America today who are saying the whole enterprise of apologetics has limited value. You can muster, the best arguments for the existence of God and for the resurrection of Jesus, and none of those arguments are going to be that compelling apart from a relationship. And I think the same thing is basically said about the old evangelistic crusades that Billy Graham would run, or people used to distribute tracts and literature, and that was effective to some degree. Do you share this assessment that in North America today, all of these things have limited value apart from relationships and some level of trust?
Yes, I do. I think the time has passed that there was some respect for Christianity, and that people would look up to you if you are a clear Christian. You're just irrelevant. But if you live a certain kind of life that is attractive, and you are an honest person, and you speak words to people, as Paul says in Colossians 4, seasoned with salt, if that is how you speak to people, then I think over time, people are going to ask, so you don't do this, you do that, you're different. What? And then those relationships are going to be important. So I think it will take longer, but by God's grace, it can still be effective.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Winston's going to ask some questions about evangelism in particular, I think. I want to ask one more question about theological education, and I don't want to cause trouble between you and the Senate or something like that. But is there, an area, do you think, at the Candian Reformed Seminary where something could change for the better that might be even more effective in preparing young men for missional endeavors. The fact is, the Canadian scene is changing. This is a mission field where we live. You're beginning to see, praise the Lord, the establishment of church plants and churches really across the Federation becoming more captivated by the enterprise of missions. Should that be reflected more in the seminary curriculum? Or is this just something that's going to be sprinkled throughout the seminary curriculum, but maybe not that visible in terms of specific courses? How do you see like the future of the seminary given the changing trend, which is a very positive trend in the Federation itself?
That's a very good question, and a question that we talk about. Not always, but quite often. You see, there's only so much you can do as a seminary. You have a limited time with the students. They come 2 semesters, 12 weeks each, and then they're off to the summer. We overload them with all kinds of good content, and we don't really want to take content away from what we give them, and yet we still want to improve and also give them more practice. Where I still see some ways to improve it is to even expand more on the internships. The past was a student would use pretty much his whole summer, 14, 15 weeks, to do landscaping or construction and make some money. And that's good. It's good to work with your hands and so forth. But I think we could still use our summers a bit more, a bit better. So I'm hoping that we can expand this mission internship, which is a 2-week minimum, to becoming a 5 or 6 week minimum. But maybe we'll have to work on then also getting that sponsored so that the students don't lose on the financial side of things.
Winston,
can I add one more thing?
Sure.
I also feel that, do we do enough on the pastoral side? It would also be so good for students if they could do an internship in a hospital or in a prison or meet people who are in problems and suffering. But then again, they are students and we cannot prepare them for everything that's going to come after seminary. So somewhere you have to say, okay, we try our best, and then they're ready and we have to let them go.
Well, and Winston, I said you could ask your questions. I'm going to ask one more follow-up question, take away from your time. But maybe, Arjan, some pressure should be put on your colleagues. I don't think it should all rest on your shoulders, but I think it's possible to teach church history in a way that respects the interface between the church and the culture in times past, and we can probably learn from that for our missional endeavor. I think if you're teaching New Testament exegesis or Old Testament exegesis with a view to preaching, you could probably think about, what does this mean for the cultural narrative that people hear today? How does the biblical narrative differ or oppose or whatever the cultural narrative? So I think it's possible probably, and maybe this is already happening, to be honest, to make some changes without necessarily altering the existing curriculum that much. And perhaps this is what's happening because it is something that's getting more attention from everybody across the board, it seems.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned church history. I know that my college in church history pays attention to mission history in church history, and that there is room for, if a student wants to do a biographical paper, that he can take the life of a missionary from the past and try to learn lessons from today. And the same goes with ethics and so many other subjects. You can go in different directions, purely pastoral or also more missional. And so we talk about those things, and as far as that is concerned, I don't have to fight for with my colleagues to fight for more missional content. It's everybody likes it, but the main thing is you have your limits in terms of time and content.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's switch here, although I'm going to ask a question related to history. First of all, in 2009, you published a 3-part series of articles in the Clarion called Evangelism According to the Scriptures. I got to know those articles. I read them personally, and then I was invited. I was a pastor in the ERQ at the time, and I got invited to speak for a couple of mission boards, or should I say evangelism committees, west in British Columbia and in Manitoba. And I left everybody with copies of those articles. And I said, read these articles. I gave them to consistory members especially, and to evangelism committees to give to their consistory members. So, if that becomes a bestseller, then I think you should at least include me in the thanks of the beginning of the book, because I did my best to try to spread the good word. I'd like to talk a few things out of that article. One of the things I loved about it is my own desire for our churches to be thinking about mission. I see that not at all as something new or a hobby horse that I particularly am invested in, or something that comes out of my own experience. But for me, that's not only part and parcel of what it means to be a Bible-believing Christian, but also what it means to be Reformed. And that if we stand in the grand history of the Reformation, then we ought to be also thinking with a mission mind. So can you say a couple of words about how being mission orientated is grounded in the Reformation, and then perhaps more specifically in our own history in the churches of the Secession?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, good. Thanks for that introduction. That's great. Yeah. Mission is part and parcel of being a church. It's one of the aspects of what it means to be a true church. So a church that is not mission-minded does something wrong, seriously wrong. So you see that in the early church. It's beautiful to read about, for example, the system of the catechumenate with Augustine and so forth, and how they developed a system to teach new members the main things of the faith, and how they took their time to do that, to make sure that there was a good foundation of new members. So going through history quickly, the Reformation, Calvin, for example, often thought that he could not be very mission-minded because of his teachings with election and so on. Well, he was very mission-minded, and he was constantly thinking about how can I send men back to France to proclaim the gospel. And then we're not even talking about his Brazil venture. And then coming to the time of the secession, after the secession, there was a strong desire in the Reformed churches in the Netherlands to reach out to the Dutch nation, and maybe you can call it a re-evangelization project. They wanted to go out and preach the gospel and make sure that people were able to hear the true gospel from the scriptures. And what I found interesting there is how leading men like Lucas Lindeboom, who later became a professor in Kampen, how he was active as a young minister. Now, in the times of those days, people were working 6 or at least 5.5 days, and Saturday afternoon was the time that people would go downtown and do some shopping. So there was a time for a minister to be there. So someone like Lucas Lindeboom would be in the downtown area or in the center of the village with some tracts and Bibles and speak to people. And they also organized themselves via classes and national synod. So all kinds of things were happening in terms of evangelism. So as far as that goes, you're right. It's in our history. There's no contrast between being Reformed and being evangelistic. But things have happened in the 20th century that have sort of slowed things down. One thing that I would mention is the fear of Methodism, the fear of Methodistic practices, the fear that if you start to organize evangelism, you're going to be Methodist. So it became quite widespread among our people, I think, that evangelism is good and necessary, but it should happen by your walk of life. It should not happen by way of you doing something special or by a church setting up a project for evangelism. That would be wrong. Then you're a Methodist. And those things came in the way, I think, and it has taken us some time to overcome that. In our own Canadian history, Canadian Reformed Church history, Reverend Van Doorn has done much. Maybe, I guess, his book, Get Out and Get Rid of Dilemmas. So he tried to fight some of those things. I think he didn't go far enough, really, because he said evangelism is important, but it should be done by the members and not by the office bearers. So if you're a minister, he said, you are an instructor. You should tell the people how they should do it, but you yourself, as a minister, should see yourself as a pastor of the sheep that are in the sheepfold already. It is not your task to go out and be an evangelist. And that is different from what they did in the secession times. In the time of the secession, there were no things like that. The ministers would be involved in evangelism. I mentioned the example of Lucas Lindeboom, and I'm sure that every minister was like that, but generally speaking, that was the idea.
And that eventually, or at one point in time, sort of gets codified in our own church order. So talk about what the interesting thing that happens in 1984 at the Synod of Cloverdale.
Yeah, I don't know what happened. I wasn't there. I've been asking around, but yeah. So I think what happened is this: they wanted to modernize the church order and update it and so on, so that it would be more modern and more in tune with our Canadian Reformed Church life. But at the same time, a few things were removed from the church order, which it's too bad, because originally the church order, the church order, I think, and also the forms of ordination would state that elders, of course, had the duty to pastor the flock, look after the sheep of the Lord. But I forget the term now, but it said something like they should also exhort others to the Christian faith. So an elder, assuming that he is a man of some standing in the community, he has some contacts, whenever he has the opportunity, he should also use that opportunity to exhort others to the Christian faith. That used to be in our church papers, and then in 1983 on the floor of Synod or the committee, I don't know what happened, but it's no longer there, which is too bad, I think.
Yeah, in your article, you conclude with, or you one paragraph concludes, speaking about this change, and it says, in my opinion, this illustrates that the Canadian Reformed churches have become more inward looking than the churches of the Reformation and the secession. Mm-hmm. You wrote that in 2009, so it's now been 11 years since you wrote that. Do you think things have changed?
Yeah, I think so. I think that this idea of, as a Christian, you should mainly or perhaps only evangelize by your way of life, and not necessarily by talking to someone. I think I don't hear that too often anymore. Also, the idea that it would be wrong to organize evangelism projects, I don't think that's defended anymore. So that fear of being Methodist, I think, is gone, and it's generally accepted that, we should, as churches, try to find ways and means of doing evangelism in this country. And the second thing that has changed, I think, it's generally more accepted that ministers of congregations should also, or may also, use part of their time to be in contact with people outside the congregation. I think 10, 15 years ago, when the minister said, I've done some home visits to people outside the church, the elders might have said, oh, why do you do that? Have you already done all your home visits in the church? But I don't think you have to defend it anymore. I think it's generally appreciated. I'm not sure in all churches in the Federation, but I think in many congregations it's appreciated if a minister can also be involved in outreach, if he can teach a new members class, something like that. And I don't think a minister has to defend it anymore. Again, I'm not sure that ministers find the time or that they are doing it too much, but I know many colleagues who tell me, this is actually so nice to do this, and I wish I would have more time to do it.
Yeah, and I certainly would agree for myself too that it's not two different things. When I'm involved in personal evangelism and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ, that does good things for my regular preaching ministry and for my other ministry in the church, certainly. Yeah. I'm hoping that with this podcast, we can, post the link to your article. It's 11 years old, but I think it's still got so much relevance, and it's got lots of good practical suggestions also for thinking through these things on a broad church level, a consistory or council level, as well as a classes level. We're 11 years onward from that. One of the reasons we're doing this podcast is because, well, we don't want to just, work hard and love our local congregations, but we would love to see, we love our federation and would love to see our federation in general grow in moving forward with the Lord's mission, the Great Commission, also locally. For yourself, if you were to rewrite this article today, is there anything specific that you would say that's slightly different, or anything that you would suggest or push a little bit more, given the realities that we're living in today? Things that you would encourage our federation in?
Yeah, I think if I wrote them today, I would still write the same things, but I would want to add some things that I think have become more important in recent years. For example, I think it's really important for guys like yourself, your leaders in the local churches, to be mission-minded as a congregation and to be missional as God's people. What does that mean practically for everybody? I've discovered that I've done many talks on evangelism, and it's quite easy to make people feel guilty because they are not doing enough. They are not talking to their neighbors, and then you stand there as a speaker and you say, yeah, there is this evangelistic calling. I think we should help our people to find ways where everybody can do something, but also taking into account gifts and opportunities, because they are quite different for different people in the church. I sometimes compare it to being in a war. You have the guys that are the front soldiers. They are way up there ahead. They are doing the actual fighting, but not everybody can do that. And you need lots of guys who are behind the front lines and bring in the goods, look after the wounded and whatever. And I think it's the same in the church of the Lord. There are people who are really good in talking to unbelievers. Fantastic. They just know how to do it. They have the social skills. They have the knowledge. They stand firm in their own faith. I'm not going to mention names, but you have those people in your church. And there are also others in the church. Please, they shouldn't do it. It's too dangerous for themselves, perhaps, or they don't have those gifts, or they don't have those opportunities, and that should be fine. Evangelism is a congregational activity. We do it all together, but we also do different things. And I think that I would have loved to say something more about that if I wrote those articles today.
Yeah, those are great points. Those are great points. We here in Ottawa, we try to encourage people. You mentioned for some of your students, they don't know where to find a non-Christian. We have plenty of people like that. If you grow up in a covenant community with all of its blessings, then sometimes you live in this bubble where you trying to get out and meet other people that are not believers can be difficult. Yeah. I try to encourage people. Just think of I had one lady in my church who said, "Well, I'm going to join a knitting club." And that doesn't mean that person has to go out and be this super extroverted evangelist who's engaging in high-level apologetics with all of the members of her knitting club. But just being part of that club will allow her to pray for those people. And, that seems to be one of the things that everybody in the church can do, to pray for unbelievers and to pray for them in meaningful ways because we've got to know them. Yeah, we don't want to give people the impression that evangelism just looks like the extroverted person who goes, doing cold calls in the neighborhood.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And yet it seems to me that we still want to we don't want to induce false guilt, and yet we do want to spur one another on. And so I think there is a place for some level of accountability where, I think it's important for pastors to be in touch every week with some unchurched people. And if you're not, I think you need to find avenues where that's possible and then keep each other accountable. That's one of the things I've benefited from personally with an accountability partner. And I need to share with him stories of people that I'm talking to who are unchurched. But I think we can do that at the level of members of the congregation as well. And people should know the names of their neighbors, for instance. And I don't think it needs to be something manipulative. It could just be befriending them and being hospitable, or being part of a book club or a knitting club or something like that. But somehow we do need to encourage more interaction minimally between those who are believers in the church and those who are not believers. I think there is a lot of caution about crossing that line, but it need not be thought of in terms of, okay, I'm going to meet somebody and right away press the claims of Christ upon that person. It's just befriending the person as another human being and maybe finding something in common with them.
There is another very interesting point there, Bill, now that you mentioned that, where again, I think as leaders, you guys need to help people think through that. We come from a background where the antithesis was really emphasized. The enmity between the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, that's what we grew up with. And I think that has influenced also our evangelism efforts, because then you look at the world as the antithesis, the enemy, and the danger is you become too inward looking and too much afraid of the dangerous world out there. A danger that I see now is that as we are disconnecting ourselves from that idea, is that there is going to be an overreaction to the other extreme, where we are going to say, oh, we always thought that the world was a bad place to be and to be avoided, but actually the world is really nice, and there is so much positive in the world, and our people are going to sort of underestimate the antithesis that is still there. I mean, yeah, we are in the world, but not of the world, and that is such a hard balance to maintain for a Christian church. And maybe we've been too much on the side of not of the world, but I'm afraid that with our frustrations, or I feel quite a bit of frustration with some of our people, with our past. We've been too inward looking, so now we're going to be outward looking. I just hope that our faith and our Christian integrity is going to be strong enough to remain standing in the world as we are in the world.
Arjan, your concern is very, very valid. I don't know if you've read any Mark Sayers. He wrote Disappearing Church, Reappearing Church. But he was kind of in the emergent church movement, coming alongside of people in the neighborhood. And that's what he was recommending for his members. And he says, this is the language he uses, the world began to colonize my church. Mm. And there were just as many people coming in as there were exiting. And so he's kind of backtracked from that approach. And now he's stressed, we need to be in the world, but we need to know our Bibles very, very well. We should be practicing spiritual disciplines and pursuing spiritual growth, because it's very possible to have this kind of interaction in the world and lose one's faith in the midst of it. So I think that's a very, very good caution. I'm not sure that's a big concern yet in the Canadian Reformed Church culture, but I think it is something to be aware of as something on the horizon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And another aspect, we don't have too much time, I guess, but what do we, in fact, your whole eschatology comes into play here. What is your expectation of where the world is going, and what can we expect the world to become when Christians live in the world? And you know this discussion well. Kuyper, for example, part of our background, he was quite optimistic. You can do a lot of influence in the world. Tim Keller likes him, so Tim Keller also, I think, is quite optimistic about transformation that we can achieve in the world. Schilder was more pessimistic in that. He was more on, we have to be active in the world, but we may not be able to achieve too much. And he talked about this, we're trying to build a pyramid, but we won't be able to finish it, things like that. That's also really important. So I find sometimes Christians can be naive about what we expect we can do in the world. And as we come from one extreme, we shouldn't go to the other extreme.
Well, that sounds like a subject for a whole nother podcast. So maybe we'll have to invite you back to talk about missional, eschatology or something. I think that would be great. Our time is up. Thanks so much for taking some of your time to share with us. And thanks for all you're doing at the seminary and for all the work that you're doing preparing young men to do mission work overseas and missional work right here in Canada. And thanks for being here today. And may God bless us all and help us all as individuals and as churches not to be of the world, but to be in it. So thank you very much for coming today.
That was great to be with you. May the Lord bless you too. Thanks.
Thanks, Arjan.
Well, I hope this conversation has been an encouragement to you. We hope to be back in just a couple of weeks, and we'll be talking with Pastor Bill and Pastor Ian Wildeboer of Mercy Christian Church, learning from them as they try to reach the city of Hamilton with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So come and join us to celebrate and be challenged here at Tyrannus Hall, a grace-filled space where we discuss the missional mandate of the Canadian Reformed Churches.